Greetings all. Welcome back to the Coptimizer podcast. Today, you just heard the introduction for our guest, and I have been super excited to have this conversation. I think at this point, everyone knows that I geek out a little bit on sciencey stuff. If you don't, you'll know for sure after this. Melis, Balban, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So we talked a little bit on the intro about NeuroSmart, but let's just kick it off. What is NeuroSmart, and what is your research, and what is your background?
Sure. So I'll start with my background. My name is Melis Yilmaz Balban. I am a neuroscientist by training. I did my PhD studying the threat responses in rodents and in neural circuits that control these threat responses. And then I realized throughout my PhD that we are too much like rodents and wanted to study the similar questions in humans in terms of fear and how we respond under threat. And then I moved to Andrew Huberman's lab at Stanford to do my postdoc research, where I studied human threat responses using physiological monitoring and virtual reality technology. And then I also looked at interventions to mitigate the effects of stress, and published several articles on that. During my research, I saw that I observed over and over again certain features of physiological responses, like the body's responses to threat, were predictive of certain behavior, certain types of behavior. So there was this relationship between the physiology and the decision making. And I wanted to show this to people. I wanted to make people aware of this, and that by regulating our physiology, we can actually optimize our decision making and behavior under threat. And so with that insight, I found NeuroSmart. I founded NeuroSmart. And NeuroSmart, my team and I are developing a technology to train for effective self-awareness and self-regulation, and ultimately better decision-making under stress. The way that we're doing it is we monitor the body's fight or flight response via a sensor you just wear on the arm. You can see it, I'm wearing it over here.
Interesting, yeah.
And that connects to a mobile phone via Bluetooth and runs it through our algorithms to give you a score of whether you're regulating optimally or not, or whether you're approaching a zone that you'll make critical mistakes. And so with this idea, we built our prototype, and we got a grant from the National Science Foundation to really continue to do our research on this technology. Our target right now is, as you know, is law enforcement, and the reason for that, several folds, is one, when I first thought about who could use this, who could benefit from technology like this, I thought of people who need to make split-second decisions that are hugely critical. And that's the technology, like this is what this particular technology really addresses, because it does monitor your moment-to-moment reactivity to cognitive and emotional stressors as well as physical stressors. So it is not a heart rate based measure. Heart rate is not very sensitive to cognitive and emotional stress, but our device is. And so, and I thought of first responders, and I went to our Coffee with Cops event in Mountain View, and pitched this idea, like, what if you had a device that you could train your physiology for better decision making? And Captain Jessica Nowosky, she's now retired as deputy chief, but she was very enthusiastic about the idea, and she said, well, let's just try it. Let's just try what our cops respond to, and how what your device shows. And so we did some pilot work with them, where we recorded from officers while they were doing some scenario-based training in a simulator environment in that case. And the idea there was, well, we know in the lab environment that these signals can tell us about poor decision making, but what about cops? We never really tested this on cops. And so that was our first pilot, where we have actually seen, yes, the same cops are human too. They have the same exact responses that we predict, and that the same kind of correlation between poor performance and poor physiology. And then that's how we got the grant with that pilot data. And then we started, we launched our pilot program and worked with several departments, including Michigan State Police, City of Miami Police, and a group in LAPD, and built our algorithms to really look at cops' physiology and their performance and training. So so now we have this product and we are actively actually forming partnerships with departments who are interested in using it in their training. I'll just put it out there. If anybody's interested in learning more, they can always contact me, and I'm sure you'll share my contact information.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll get to that. Oh my gosh.
I'll stop.
So this is so cool. Where to start? First and foremost, I think a lot of police officers might be familiar with Andrew Huberman from his podcast, from the Huberman Labs podcast. And, quick shout out to you and to him for all the work that you do. I listen to it every week. I actually just shared it with a group of high school athletes this morning, because I'm helping at our local high school do some of the summer conditioning. And of course, it's getting warm and people sweat a lot. And so you have some people that just want to chug water, others don't want to chug water. So trying to get them to understand the science, even just the science behind water, like give them something to listen to. But I really think that's cool that you partnered with your police department in the Valley there. We're I'm very fortunate. I'm right in the same town here as Purdue University. Purdue is a engineering. It's a very STEM oriented university, and I've done some similar work like that. And so I just want to start by first giving this shout out to all the universities and then all the police departments that create those partnerships. If you've got a university, oh my gosh, you have Stanford in your own backyard, like we have Purdue here. There are so many people out there that are willing to help and that want to help, that are looking to solve big problems and have the big brains to go with it. Really, really encourage everybody to engage in those partnerships. There's a ton of stuff that we could talk offline about what we've done with some partners at Purdue, but
yeah.
So you said something, obviously this is the Coptimizer podcast. We think, it's a play on word, cop optimization. How do we optimize our performance? How do we build towards peak performance? And one of the themes that we've generally hit on is the most important piece of equipment that any police officer has is resting in the 6 inches in between their ears, the brain.
Right.
And it doesn't matter what kind of car you're driving. It doesn't matter what kind of gun you have. It doesn't matter what kind of rifle setup you have. All the toys, all those things, they are very important, but not nearly as important as the old noggin and optimizing our ability to use it. So when you say cops physiology and you're studying cop physiology, have you noticed any difference between cop physiology and just the general population and their physiology? Or what are some of the things that maybe stood out to you when you started working with police officers?
Well, I mean, overall, I've seen some very general similarities. So just the basic threat response when we're faced with a threat, everybody shows a response and everybody has a recovery period, and depending on how we recover or how big your response is or how often you respond to things that don't exist, your behavior gets influenced. So those are kind of the main themes that are shared between cops and non-cops. One difference that was striking to me was because I did my postdoc in a virtual reality experiment, I collected some data of threat responses in a virtual reality environment from general population, and it was quite effective VR in inducing stress responses. When I did this with cops, when they're simulator training, this is just one example of like 20 officers. So I just want to say the caveat is there's tons of factors that go into this type of training, the scenario and how it's set up, how realistic the simulation is, et cetera, et cetera. But the responses were so much lower than their responses to the real role player, like scenario-based training. So I was quite surprised because I would, in my experience with VR, is very effective in inducing this threat. But when I looked at cops and put them in the VR and then in the real scenario, the difference was huge. So the real world scenarios were really, really a lot more effective. So that was surprising to me.
Yeah, that
Not
is
to
interesting.
say that the simulators are not effective. I think there's a lot of room for using them, there are a lot of reasons for using them. But perhaps creating the most amount of fear is not one of the reasons.
Yeah, I think where the simulators really come in is that you can operate those solo. You don't need anybody else to participate with you. So you can prepare and run through different scenarios and get yourself comfortable and familiar with what a response might be. And then you can, when you have the opportunity to test in a simulated environment using role players with things like simunition, maybe you had an opportunity to participate in some of that training, or at least watch it, where police officers are shooting the paintballs at each other. Yeah. I have found that I was a trainer for years. I was a SWAT officer, a SWAT commander for years. And so, one of the things that we were always trying to do is really dose stress appropriately and ramp it up as you go. It's just like a young police officer that's entering into policing. Everything is new to them. They've never seen it before, so everything seems to be very stressful. But then after 6 months or a year,
Yes.
their baseline drops.
Yes.
So an example I try to give to Police Citizens Academy in terms of how often do police officers face stressful events compared to the general population. I've heard data that will say over the course of their career, a police officer will see close to 200 significant traumatic events in their career. And again, I think I'm not sure where those numbers come from. I think it really just depends on where you work and what your environment is. But it wouldn't be surprising to me to see that number in the thousands for officers that work in very busy agencies. So I think the challenge is how do you train police officers to emotionally regulate, and first and foremost understand what emotional regulation even is.
Yes.
In order to train for it.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. I mean, I think this is what we are trying to shift the perspective a little bit here is to training the mind and training the skill of emotional awareness and regulation rather than training for a particular stressor or a particular external event let's first know what's in here, like you said, where we are, where we need to be. And once we train on that, no matter what comes on, at us, because we can't control that, we're more prepared and we're less likely to be traumatized. And if we are traumatized, we're more likely to seek help and be aware of that. So yeah, I think that training that core skill of emotional awareness and regulation is very, very important.
Good. Okay, so again, and maybe here's another great example from another researcher from Stanford, Robert Sapolsky. I think a lot of people are familiar with his work, but he wrote a book once called why zebras don't
get ulcers.
Yeah, why zebras don't get ulcers. That was it. I have one of our police chaplains is also a psychologist, and he's a big fan of Sapolsky's work, and he tells a funny story. He describes it like this. He's like, all right, you've got this, a group of zebras. They're running around in the plains, and then all of a sudden a lion appears, and they all say, lion, and they all run. And when they all run, then the lion catches one of them and so that guy's a goner, and the way Dr. Will says this joke, he's also a comedian too, which makes it kind of entertaining. But he's like, all the zebras will look and say, "Oh, they got Fred," and then they go right back to baseline.
Right.
And so to them, the threat's over because Fred has been the sacrificial zebra in this case. Everyone else goes right back to baseline from a physiological perspective.
Yes.
But humans don't respond that way. Humans get that, you're talking about, and again, I don't want to get too deep in here, but officers, I think, are trained to be on the awareness of the difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The difference is it's one thing to be aware of it. It's another thing to train to be able to respond to those inevitable stressors that we're going to face. Like the zebras, it's in their physiology. They go right back down the baseline. That doesn't happen in people, though, generally.
Yeah, I mean, people have a more sophisticated threat response because we have a more developed prefrontal cortex that after each event it evaluates it, and we have a very active, what we call a default mode network, which again, so when I talk about how the brain works, I talk about three networks. One is a salience network, whose job is to really alert us. People talk about stress, people talk about fear, amygdala, but the real job is not for you to be scared or to be traumatized. The real job is to protect you and to get you to be alert enough so that you can respond. So that's the goal of what we call the salience network. So its job is to direct your attention to whatever it thinks is it's important in that moment. And then in a healthy brain, what happens is the prefrontal cortex kicks in and says, okay, have I got the resources? Do I know what to do? I see you. I see the threat. Thanks, Salience Network, for alerting me. I got this. You can quiet down. And, I have a plan. I'll handle it. I know my tactics, whatever. And then once the action is over, once the execution is over, the default mode network kicks in and says, well, what happened? Like, what does it all mean? So what is it all like? What does that make me? Like, if let's just say I made a mistake, right? Plan went poorly. Like, did I mess up? Am I going to get fired? Like, am I a loser? What does that mean about me? So it's what I call the me network, like integrates everything, puts it in your storyline, makes a story of your life based on what you think it is, what your past experiences are. So these interpretation parts and even the planning part is a lot more sophisticated in humans, and therefore we have the tendency to linger on things longer, and to create maladaptive storylines, and which ultimately feeds back into the salience network, which makes you more hyper alert, could make you more hyper alert, and you can be a lot more alert in things maybe you shouldn't be, and stuff like that. So you can imagine how in any of these three networks can take over and make this, make you a dysfunctional person. And that's kind of what I want people to be aware of. We have these networks that in a healthy state are all there so we can live a happy, healthy life, right? We need to build a storyline. We need to have a sense of self. We need to, all of these things. We need to execute. We need to be alert, all these things. But if you're, thinking too much, ruminating on what happened, putting it in a negative context, that will feed back into your threat response, and that will make you do the poor decision. Or you might be an overthinker and you might, lack the execution. And that's another, I'll stop there. But just how sophisticated our brains are is one of the reasons we suffer from traumatic experiences after the threat is gone.
And I think, yeah, that was brilliant. I don't think I've ever heard it explained as simply and as well as that. That was awesome. And so, we hear a lot about PTSD in police officers. So ultimately, what PTSD is a combination of exposure to these events and then a disconnect from the salience network, where we're just not reevaluating and assimilating that what happened to us in that experience in a way that's productive, it becomes counterproductive. And so, and I'm not saying this is just about PTSD, but if you want to reduce the likelihood of experiencing PTSD, then not just being aware of these three networks, it's also being aware of methods that we can utilize to intervene to make sure that we're returning these to baseline and that we're processing our experiences in a positive way and not a negative way.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I think, after every critical incident, it's incredibly important to, and I know this is already being done, but I'm not sure how well it's done or if is it sufficient. But I think a big part of it is there is still some stigma around mental health and talking about mental health. And sometimes the cop might not even be aware of the trauma, because sometimes the trauma comes in later, like it's just a time scale. It's because it's so it's a protection mechanism. Trauma is a protection mechanism. It happens when trauma is what I like to call it is what you think is going to happen, what your brain predicts, and what actually happens are very different from each other. So something happens to you that you never ever thought could have happened. Like it just came out of the blue. You never thought it would happen. You never thought you would have that emotional reaction to it. And you just shut down. Essentially, that disconnect happens. And when you do shut down, it can be difficult to know. You can just say, I'm okay. And then, those nightmares and all those symptoms appear later. So I think it's very important to create this awareness, but also to have a routine of techniques. Like you said, there are many techniques and we can go into details about it, but things like expressive journaling, things like breath work, different types of breath work, talking with a therapist, are all things that could be done in the immediate aftermath of a critical event, whether or not the person feels like they're okay or not. Like that's irrelevant, I think, because better safe than sorry. We don't have that awareness. I don't think we can count on an awareness after a traumatic event. That's one of the things that does go away after a traumatic event.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think to your question about, are we training this in policing? I think we are. Mm-hmm. I don't think we're doing it well at scale. I think we have pockets of people that are really beginning to understand this, and they're developing it. I think where the problem is for us is that that we don't always acknowledge that the mind and the body are connected. We can't separate them. So we have to take a holistic approach to training our mental and emotional health in conjunction with our physical health and with our spiritual health, and do this in a way where we'll come back to that, optimizing our processes, because your stated goal, I think, is it should be the number one goal for every police department in America, is that when you hire a police officer, you have to, number one, hire the people that are best suited for the job. Two, you have to equip them with the best equipment and everything that we can give them. But then most importantly, we have to train them to optimize their ability to make decisions under stress. And that's it, because that's what every day is. It's not the 100 decisions that you make that you do right, or the 100 decisions that you make wrong where you still have good outcomes. It's the one decision that you make wrong where you have a bad outcome. Mm-hmm. that can be a career ender. And sometimes people don't want to believe that it's preventable, that there were things that we could have done to intervene. And the last thing I'll say on that too, the body camera proliferation in law enforcement has given us an up close view of what policing has always known. Now we just get to see it, how police officers do respond under stress. And we see cases of just amazing response, but we also see things that scratch our head. And unfortunately, the head scratching incidents are the ones that generally tend to make the big headlines. And then people want to make broad generalizations about policing as a whole. It's terrible. It's broken. It needs to be defunded. We need to wipe out the whole system, when in reality, policing has never been better. We're just being exposed to areas where we need to improve, and the tools are there. And people like you out there doing the research that are laying the foundation for what the future of training is going to look like. There, got that all out.
Yeah, thank you. I agree that training the mind and the body to respond optimally under stress, and also destigmatizing the idea around stress. I think there's a lot of myths around, stress is bad for you, like don't stress, this is a stressful job, like, all of that. It should just to know that it is a human response. It's a biological response that everybody has to a challenge, and police officers, it's their job to handle, challenging situations. It's their job. So, essentially they need to regulate their stress. They need to befriend their stress and to know what that feels like in their body and their mind, to know their own red zones and their own, what their comfort zone is, what they're not comfortable. So yeah, I think when they sign up, as an officer to department, or even in the academy, I think this needs to be core part of training. It's just training the mind, and it not just lecture format, not just wellness. We will bring in a expert who's going to talk about meditation. We'll all do a 5-minute meditation, and that's it. Like, obviously that's not going to be enough. Right. So it needs to be a standardized training, just like firearms training, that's repeated. That's first, you get the foundation in the academy, and then you have that mandatory training throughout the year to renew, and hopefully people do it on their own as well. But at the very least, it needs to be mandated as a regular part of core training.
Yeah, stress is your friend. Stress is not your enemy. That's for sure. If we didn't have stress, we'd get eaten by a lot more lions. we'd get bitten by a lot more deadly snakes.
Yes.
So overstress is a bad thing. Understress is also a bad thing, where we don't ramp up sufficiently for what an actual threat is. So I want to go to the technology and just kind of talk about, because what you just said is critically important. It's one thing to be aware, it's another thing to practice.
Right.
So you have to practice these things. If you don't practice them, then you're not going to get better. Firearm skills, the psychomotor skills are perishable. If you only go to the range once a year, you're in big trouble if the doo-doo hits the fan and you've got to make a split-second decision.
Yes.
You're playing with fire, and quite frankly, you're playing with your life. So, agencies do have, and this is where funding comes in, and proper staffing and all these things I kind of want to touch on, because the environment that we're working in right now is actually counterproductive in that we don't have enough people coming into the profession. We're getting a different type of employee that's viewing, I think, that manages stress just a little bit different. I think there's some good opportunities there with that. But we have retiring and retirements, people leaving the profession sooner than they ever used to. So now you have an existing workforce that is smaller in number. The calls for service are not decreasing. So that puts more pressure on the existing workforce, which makes these topics so important. Like, all right, if we're gonna work people, more and more in higher stress environments, and we really have to teach these skills for how do we train them to be better emotionally regulated. And so you mentioned something early on where you talk about heart rate isn't necessarily a good predictor for how we manage stress. I've been geeking out for the last several years. I was wearing a Fitbit for years. Fitbit tracked heart rate, and I'll give you just a quick example. I was talking with someone on my department. This was probably 6 or 7 years ago. And he showed me his data from his Fitbit from a weekend shift. We worked 12-hour shifts, and his baseline heart rate for the 3 days that he was working was over 20 beats higher per minute while he was working than when he was off.
Right.
So, and these were the typical day, his resting heart rate was in the mid 50s. During his workday, his resting heart rate was approaching 90 the entire day. And so there were periods of time, and he didn't have any foot chases or physical fights or anything like that. He went to a few domestic disputes, like where there was some yelling, screaming, stuff like that, some emotional stressing events, but not necessarily physically stressing. And you could see there's these huge spikes in heart rate. And so I really got interested then. This was when HRV was kind of starting to gain a little bit of notice, more specifically with athletes. But I was very curious. I'm like, okay, well, if we start looking at HRV for these officers, not just heart rate, we can start to understand when an officer is in a state of recovery and when they're not in a state of recovery. But so I switched from a Fitbit to a Whoop strap to be able to do that, and now I see even next level with what you're doing, is particularly from a training environment. So what is it about what you're doing at NeuroSmart? First and foremost, what is it that the device is actually capturing? What's it measuring?
Sure. It measures the skin conductance response. So that is, or sometimes it's called a galvanic skin response. It is literally the electrical conductivity of your skin. So there are two electrodes that you can see here that are, that form a closed circuit, and we're measuring the conductance or resistance of that circuit that changes as a function of sympathetic nervous system activity. So skin conductance response is a measurement that's been used for decades in the lab as a measure of autonomic nervous system, particularly sympathetic nervous system activity. So when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, one of the things that happens is the sweat glands get activated by the sympathetic nerves, and they start filling up with sweat, which changes the electrical properties of the skin because they're right underneath it. Even if you're not, sweating profusely, you will still pick up the signal that your sweat glands are getting ready. And so that's what we're measuring. It's very much, it's a lot more sensitive than heart rate to moment stressors. While heart rate, like the example you gave, is great because over days, if you're working at high stress jobs, your heart rate will be higher over a period of a day, because your body's always responding to the challenge. Your body's always, it knows you're on the job, it knows there could be stuff, so it's that come up unexpectedly, and therefore it keeps your heart rate at an elevated level, which is expected, it's normal. And then if it comes back down when that stressor is gone. But on a moment-to-moment basis, so just things like somebody puts their hand in a backpack, and is it a cell phone or is it a gun? And that kind of moment-to-moment decisions are more accurately reflected in the skin conductance response than the heart rate, because heart rate is it's influenced by a lot of things, by physical fitness, motion, etc. It is influenced by emotion as well. Of course, it is sympathetically driven, but it's not the only thing that regulates our heart rate. And so that's kind of the difference between heart rate and what we're measuring, the skin conductance. As far as HRV is a good measure of parasympathetic activity and the parasympathetic tone and how it compares to the sympathetic tone. But HRV is it's heart rate variability, right? So for those who are not familiar with HRV, what it is it looks at your heart rate, your series of heart rate, it measures the time between each heart rate. So if you have a heart rate at 60 beats per minute, it doesn't mean that your heart is beating on the second at each second. Sometimes it's 0.7 seconds, sometimes it's 1.3 seconds, sometimes it's 1 second. And HRV is the measure of that variability between heartbeats. And to get a good measure, you need to have good data, series of data. So you cannot have an HRV change on a second-to-second basis, because if you just have 2 heartbeats, right? The smallest time interval is about 2 minutes that it starts becoming meaningful. So in about 2 minutes, you can start getting some idea of your parasympathetic sympathetic balance. The things you see on your numbers you see on your typical Fitbit, Whoop, those are things that actually are measurement over 24 hours. So they'll give you one number for the day, typically, and that's how you know your recovery, etc. So so there are many measurements, many ways of analyzing the HRV, but it is a statistical measure. It's not something you measure directly out of your body like heart rate is, or GSR is. So I think it's a good measure of your general stress levels. And I think as a consumer device, it's useful to when I was wearing it, I always saw that my HRV was higher on the weekend. So higher HRV, higher variability is associated with more recovery and more parasympathetic tone, and lower HRV is low is bad, high is good, essentially. And I noticed that on the weekends, I was always I had this trend of high on the weekend and low during, just like your friend with the heart rate, right?
Right.
And so that was interesting to see. And the days that I exercise, my HRV would go higher. Like the day after I exercise, my HRV would be higher. So just kind of seeing how those life changes are impacting, or poor sleep definitely impairs HRV, dehydration impairs HRV. Those are great lifestyle measurements that you can use those numbers to improve your choices, your meals, even meals. Meals will impact your sleep, will impact your HRV. But they're not moment to moment decision making. I can't look at your HRV and say you're going to make a bad decision. But the technology that we're developing is making that connection. It looks like how your body's responding to that threat, and say whether you're likely to make a poor decision or not.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. And yes, poor sleep. And because having spent the first, I think it was 14 years working nights by choice, I loved working the night shift. I didn't realize how poor my recovery was, because that was just my existence. I worked nights all the time. And then I had a period of 6 months where I was going to a leadership school. So I was working 2 weeks during the day, and then I would go back to work and was working midnight shifts for 2 weeks. And then I would go back to working days for 2 weeks, and then go back. I went back to the midnight shift. And by the time I got through that, I didn't know which way was up. I found quite, it's kind of scary, because there were some days where, and I told this story in one of the other episodes, but I found myself one morning sitting in my driveway in my car with my foot on the brake. The car was not in park, and I didn't remember how I got there. I had no idea. I'm like, I 13.1 miles from my headquarters building to my driveway at the time, and I don't remember any of it. And so I was like, well, this is not good. Something has to give here. Just as a quick aside, cops, they work a lot of hours, and they work irregular shifts. Shift work, we know, is a carcinogen. It's not good for health. So where I really think the HRV can be helpful is, like you said, it's kind of like steering a battleship, right? I can turn, I can turn the wheel, but the ship's just not going to respond right away. It's going to take time. So when you think in terms like that, the HRV, I think, can guide us in terms of making good decisions over the long term. But what you're talking about is the quick decision that I have to make in this moment. So I guess my question would be is, if you see someone that has a a very low recovery consistently over time? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to make a bad decision under stress, but my perspective has always been, well, it is setting us up to increase the likelihood of making a bad decision. Whereas if we were in a better state of recovery, then I feel like we would be in a better position to make good decisions in those split seconds.
Yes, I mean, it looks like this. It depends on the scale you look at it. I mean, I've seen really healthy cops making poor decisions, and they don't have the training.
Me too. Been there, done that.
And very stressed out, experienced sleep deprived cops still doing great decisions, but who knows when they're going to break? Like you said, one day you come home and you don't remember anything. And so, yes, for sure, showing that low recovery over just gives you an alert saying, well, you need to change something, you need to sleep or something. Your likelihood of making a poor decision, despite your training, despite your experience, despite what a good cop you are, is high right now, just because of the way your body and mind is working. But I think where our tool really comes in is in the beginning of a career where you don't have that experience and you generally haven't had that kind of stress in your life. I mean, some people come from military and maybe they've had that kind of training, but a lot of cops don't. And so the first time you're, facing this kind of situation. And so I think that's where our tool can give the best value, showing this is your response to it. When you first started the academy, see how much you've grown, in 3 months, or like, this is where you need to be. And this is what you need to do to get there, to be really at your optimal when you graduate and go to your patrol. That's where the bigger value is, I think, for us.
Yeah, and that's awesome. That's where I want to get to, because ultimately what you're talking about, and maybe you have observed this in the trainings that you're doing. Like, so the example you gave, we're running through a scenario. You have a role. Well, let's just say, even if it's even virtual or even a live scenario, role player based training, you have a suspect that you're watching his hands. That's what we train officers, right? We got our standoff distance. We're in a good position. We're aware of our surroundings. We're watching hands, and then suddenly the hand goes into a pocket or it goes into a backpack. So with the NeuroSmart device, if I'm thinking about this correctly, or correct me if I'm wrong, I guess, I would imagine we're going to see a spike in activity there because we're seeing a potential stressor.
Right.
And now the hand comes out. I quickly identified that is a phone, not a gun. And ideally, I return back to baseline.
Yes.
And okay, threat, no threat. I'm there. I'm back to baseline. If I can't tell what it is, or if I'm not trained appropriately, I get amped up. I'm way up here, and then I stay up there. And so now everything that happens next, I'm in an elevated or dysregulated position, or a higher state of dysregulation. Maybe that's a better way to say it. Doesn't mean I'm going to make a poor decision next, but it means like I'm on my way to, what I call, the doom loop, where I'm amping up, and now I get stuck into that vortex and I can't get out. And I'm going to rely, if I can't pull myself out, I'm going to rely on a partner or somebody else to pull me out, to snap me back, some kind of cue to bring me back down the baseline. So am I thinking about that accurately?
That's exactly right. I mean, you just described our best use case is detecting those amping ups that can happen really quickly within a scenario, and that can lead to a poor decision. But it really started, 1 minute ago when you first recognized that backpack and you got amped up, but you never really recovered from that, even though you consciously thought, okay, this is not a gun, I relax, but you didn't. You're still alert. More alert than you were in the beginning of the scenario. So kind of a more risky place, and then that influences your next move. Maybe instead of I don't know the tactics here. I'm just making it up. I don't know what's the right thing to do, but
I don't think you need to know the tactics, right, to understand the physiology behind
maybe
it.
Talking through this now that there's no gun there. Maybe you close your distance. Maybe you do, but like you do something that slightly increases the tension even more. And this is something that I see over and over again. And on the other side, I've seen officers that go in pairs, and one of them completely misses the threat. It's a completely flat signal. So you just kind of go, they align the signals, and you see one of them saw it and the other one didn't, just nothing. And you wouldn't be able to tell that. I mean, you can ask the person, of course, afterwards, but this also allows you to kind of see, did you see that? Did you see how his hand moved in that split second? Did you pick up on that? And then did you recover properly? So those are things that we can tell and give that feedback.
Yeah, that's great. So I would expect an officer that's got a higher EQ, a higher level of emotional intelligence, is going to most likely be in a better position also to return to baseline, not make assumptions, but make decisions based on what they know is happening rather than a perceived threat. Like, what can I confirm? So I guess in the end, what you have is a brilliant training tool that gives you diagnostic data. It's giving you information. It's giving you these benchmarks. It's not telling you what to do, what not to do. It's not saying good or bad. It's just telling you this is the way that your body is reacting. So that brings a higher level of awareness to the individual. Once I'm aware there are things that I'm missing and I'm not stressing when I should be. And I think we would all anticipate for a young officer that's never been exposed to the things that a seasoned, like a field training officer, or just maybe a SWAT officer, or somebody that's worked in a lot of high stress environments. They just have more experience to lean back on, to go into their own individual catalog for what's a threat, what's not a threat, assuming that they've been trained well and trained adequately. And then because a poor trainer, someone that's amping somebody up, that telling everything is a threat, right? There's a potential for everything to be a threat. Then we might get somebody, their baseline might be higher than it should be.
Yeah.
So, oh man, yeah, we could talk for hours about this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, each situation that I record from is really unique. And as you said, I do believe the biggest value is that awareness piece. We do offer interventions as well. If the algorithm detects somebody's not regulating properly, it will tell them to take, it will guide them through a breathing exercise. And it will, advise that they do this breathing exercise prior to a call or during similar encounters. But it's really that pairing of that exercise with that data to say, like you said, I mean, when you're, the heart rate example again, it doesn't tell you what to do, but just seeing that your heart rate is 20 beats higher on a consistent basis when you're working versus not gives you a sense of yourself, and maybe you do something about that.
So I'm not sponsored by Muse. Maybe I should be. But have you ever used the Muse headset?
Yes, I do have one. Yes.
Okay, so here's why I bought one, because meditation is this esoteric thing where it's like, I need something tangible. Me personally, I don't need it, I should say. I prefer to be able to see something, because if you tell me to sit down and do some controlled breathing, allow my thoughts to wander, we can go through a meditation training. When I was first trying to figure it out, like, sometimes I would sit in my chair for like 15 minutes and feel like, did I even get anything accomplished? So when I heard about this technology, so for those that aren't aware, Muse is a headset that you wear. There's a couple different versions of them. I actually have the Muse 2 now, and I wear it when I sleep. But I can see at the end of a session, I can watch track the activity in the brain and see when my brain is active, when it's and basically when it's in a state of relaxation, and I can and they also give you some music as a cue, or sounds as a cue. If your mind starts to wander, the music gets loud, and as you come back into yourself, it settles down. So what that taught me was, okay, there are times where I feel like I'm really active, but I'm not. There are times that I feel like I'm not active at all, but I am. And so the data is just a feedback tool for me to help me in my practice. but it was in it. But after several months of doing that, I did find myself, we talk about, the stimulus gap, right? From the time that we have a stimulus and the time that we react, I did find like, okay, my emotional control is higher. I could feel it. I could literally feel like, okay, I'm more relaxed. I'm not gonna, I'm not formulating my answers in my head before the person is done talking, even just in a training environment or in a meeting environment, not even in a high stress environment. I found that was beneficial. So I see the same thing with what you're doing. It's an awareness tool.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, I've seen for my personal use of my device, I have it on majority of the time just because I'm testing it and debugging it all the time. But I noticed my stress levels throughout different Zoom meetings and stuff I do, and that was also eye-opening because sometimes, especially in policing, I mean everybody's stressed, right? Like it's not even just policing. Well, most people are chronically stressed without being aware of it. And when we are chronically stressed, we really lose grip of our, those more nuanced responses that we give to external events. We snap easier and faster, and we might notice it, but we don't really have an awareness of where it's coming from, or we're just in that state at that point, just that's a higher baseline. But having a tool that showed me, look, there's this, Tuesday meeting that's really significantly, firing you up. It was really eye-opening for me. And I just said, well, do I really need this meeting? Can I, put it in a different time? I don't want to be in the beginning of my week in a very productive time that, I'm a morning person, and typically Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday are, my hardworking days, and Thursday I'm just kind of catching up and, the dialing the week and stuff like that. So it allowed me to make changes, slight adjustments, so that I could be more productive. I could be just happier and less stressed. Just seeing that huge difference between what my Tuesday looked like with and without that meeting.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's so police officers, you're going, especially if you're in a busy agency and you're going from call to call, if you're on a call that gets you amped up. So what your device would help us do is, if we can simulate some of these things in a training environment, then we take a break. We walk through a breathing exercise and explain the why behind the breathing exercise, but then also be able to show, look at the data and look at the way that your physiology is responding to this intervention.
Yeah.
And now that reinforces that positive feedback loop, like, okay, this does work. This isn't some, hocus pocus thing that I see someone wearing funny clothes sitting in a funny chair doing. This is something that can be very beneficial to me.
That's exactly right. You see the effect of breathing immediately, and that signal just lowers you down.
So I watched. I'm not going to change gears too much, but on your website you recorded some training that you did with the Michigan State Police, and I would highly encourage all the listeners to go watch that, because it was a much deeper dive and breakdown than we're going to have time to get into today. But you talked about why the insula was the favorite part of the brain, your favorite part of the brain. So I definitely wanted to ask you about that, and why that would be important to cops, because while we're not monkeys, I don't want to spoil it, we are knuckle draggers in a lot of sense. So
yes. Yes. So insula, I mean, my love for the insula started when I was doing an experiment and recording brain activity from patients. So these are, it's rare to record extracellular activity other than non-invasive devices that record, I have a simunition round in my hand.
Nice. I like
it. Okay. So what was I saying? Yeah. So in human patients, it's humans, it's difficult to record from brain areas that are deep down. So a lot of the EEG devices, or like Muse headset and stuff like that, record, superficial signals. And fMRI, of course, you go in an MRI machine and you lay down still to record the brain activity down, but you can't really do much while doing that. So you can't really relate that activity to a realistic task. So we kind of took on a mission to be able to record deep brain signals while people are awake and acting. Collaborated with Dr. Eddie Chang in UCSF, he's the head of neurosurgery at UCSF, who operates on patients with intractable epilepsy all the time. So what these patients come into the hospital, he implants electrodes all over the brain. These are intracranial electrodes. They go deep in your brain. And then the patients are awake and they're waiting for the seizure to happen. So the purpose of the electrode is to locate the seizure so that the surgeon can operate on it. But while they're waiting, sometimes it can take a week or two, or sometimes a month for a seizure to happen. We went in there, we brought in a virtual reality headset and put them through a simulated heights situation where the hospital room would open up and all of a sudden they're in the sky in their hospital beds, and just to get their threat responses measured. And we were looking at this signal, this skin conductance response, at the same time recording from brain areas that and what we found is among many regions that we recorded, insula showed correlation with the skin signal that we were recording. So that's the sympathetic nervous system activity. And it was, these patients are very rare. So it was only 3 patients that we were able to record, and they had electrodes in that particular brain region. So that's when I got really interested, because I feel like finding a moment-to-moment correlation between a brain area and something we can measure from the skin, just without going into surgery to put electrodes in your brain, I thought was great, that we can use a signal as a proxy for brain activity. Then I looked at what is insula, what's this brain region that at that point I didn't know anything about. I knew it was part of the salience network. And I found that, in the literature, it's this area that receives a lot of the bodily signals. So it responds to temperature, it responds to pain. So it correlates with all these, it also responds to anxiety. But it correlates with external signals like pain and temperature from the skin. But what's even more fascinating is it has different parts. It has the posterior insula and anterior insula. The posterior insula seems to be more of a reflection of the actual temperature, actual like pain stimulus, whereas the interior insula seems to be a reflection of our interpretation of that signal. So people were asked, for example, in a study, how cold, they were put in an ice bath, and they were asked how cold did that feel, and they found that particularly interior insula is correlating with how they felt, how cold it was, and posterior insula was correlating with how cold it actually was, the actual temperature. So there is that part of our brain that takes the physical external information and integrates it with your decision making or memory, whatever, and interprets it in a way, that now becomes your reality, essentially. So I think that's it's such a bridge to mind and the body, and then other studies have found that you can create a sensation of gut inflammation in your intestines by stimulating the insula. So it's not just a one-way connection of signal comes from the body and then it gets interpreted. You can also make yourself feel a particular way by sending the signal back down. So it really is this two-way hub that modulates how we feel and how we're supposed to feel based on what happens upstairs in the brain. So that's why I'm fascinated by it. It is, we always talk about the mind and body connection, but we finally found where it is physically located and evidence for it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And again, there's just another perfect example of why your work is so important, because once you recognize that and you understand that you have a way to influence it positively, then it gives you a little bit more control. Or at least to me, it's like that's why I've always liked to look at data and numbers. It feels like um, I have more influence over my actions, and my actions that now have um, are not necessarily just guided by random thoughts, but rather specific thoughts. And in the end, it just comes down to training. So if I train well, if I set training up appropriately and I dose stress appropriately, then I can build over time.
Yeah.
And get better.
Yeah.
All right, so we got about 10 minutes or so, because we've been going for a while, and I'm not even like halfway through everything that I wanted to ask. So so I kind of want to just maybe quickly touch on, in that presentation, you also talk about the 4 pillars of NeuroSmart, and you're talking about readiness, vigilance, self de-escalation, and recovery. And without maybe not getting into it too deep, the de-escalation part I think is important to maybe touch on a little bit more. I've got this mantra that it's best to lead yourself first, understanding what's going on inside your own brain before you try to interpret things that are going on around you. The quicker you can do that, obviously, the better it's going to be. But de-escalation is a two-way street, and it's hard to we can't de-escalate somebody else if we can't de-escalate ourselves first. That's always kind of been my position. So I don't know if there's anything in there real quick that you wanted to touch on, or what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think de-escalation is a loaded subject these days.
Yes.
But but I, we look at it from a self-regulation perspective. It's not de-escalating a particular situation, but de-escalating yourself. And what we do is, our tool comes in best during scenario-based training. It's designed for that. And so we record some data prior to the scenario start, and then we mark when the scenario starts and record data throughout the scenario, and then mark when the scenario ends and record after the scenario. And based on so the self-de-escalation score is calculated how you respond to threats throughout the scenario. That's how we do that. And like the example we talked about earlier about somebody reaching for their backpack, and that would be a great example where are you able to come back to baseline after that mini threat, or are you able to maybe recover only 50% or 60%, and that's where we automatically calculate. And there are many things that happen. Let's say it's one of my favorite scenarios that I work with in Michigan State is a sovereign citizen, where the conversation just keeps going on and on and on, and the person is not compliant. The driver is not compliant, and you can see when there's stuff that they say that is triggering, the officer gets triggered, and how that sometimes quickly escalates to the officer opening the door and getting the guy trying to this messy fight trying to get him out, the seat belt and stuff, versus it's being handled a little bit more less eventful way.
Yes. Yeah.
Again, I don't know the correct response to this, but I can tell the level of action by how the person is either keeping a level head throughout the conversation or slowly getting amped up in the signal. I can tell how it's going to end. And so that's what we calculate is by self de-escalation.
Yeah. And so every cop in America right now, that if we had one of those devices on them, just the mention of a sovereign citizen or a First Amendment auditor. Did they talk to you about First Amendment auditors?
No, but I can imagine.
Yeah, it's a very similar kind of it's basically these groups that are antagonists. They've got a certain philosophical position, and their mission in life is to go around and trigger people and to generate a response. So they capture it on video and then they monetize it through their YouTube channels.
Okay.
Yeah, and but it is a really good example for agencies. If you have people that are doing that in your area, this training, your device would be, I couldn't encourage you enough to bring this in and actually train with it. So, because you can show people, and you could really probably incorporate just actual body cam footage from events that an agency has experienced, to be able to show, okay, and now number one, we can show people where they're getting triggered, what portion of the event is triggering them. So the next time that they experience that, they know, all right, this is where this is where I've gone off the rails before. So I got to take a deep breath. You know, here's my cue. And that's brilliant training. That's brilliant training. Oh my gosh. Our favorite things. You could probably just get on YouTube and just, if you do a search for First Amendment auditors.
I'll do that. That should be fun. So our device also records camera, and that's how we're able to sync the moment-to-moment camera with the stress, so you can actually see what's the trigger. Down the line, we hope to incorporate it with the body cam, so you don't need to wear an extra device for camera. But for now, we record with the phone that we provide, so you have the camera that's in synchrony with the stress levels. Yeah.
There's from a wellness perspective, there's so much potential here. We'll have to have another conversation down the road, because this is where, from a physical one, so the cardiovascular risk for a police officer, 18 times that of the general population. Cardiovascular disease is by far and away the number one killer of cops. It's not even close. Second place. Suicide right now is higher than dying by assault. It's higher than dying in a vehicular crash. So as we start wrapping this up, I think that's important for law enforcement leaders to really think about this. We're training. We have to train everything, right? There's certain things you just can't train out, but knowing what's killing us the most, that seems like maybe we should spend more time in those areas. And I think maybe the good news is that it's not going to take a lot of time. It's front loading with knowledge, education, and experience. So they have the knowledge up front, and they can make good decisions down the road throughout the course of their career.
Yeah, and not just decisions, but for their health, like you said, to take care of their health and their body. And one way to do that is to navigate day-to-day stressors effectively, because if they can do that, then they will offset that risk by quite a bit. The heart disease happens due to stress, there are other things, of course, poor diet and stuff, but I think this proportion comes from the stress and poor regulation.
The other thing, so along those lines, in talking about recovery, right? How long does it take to recover after an incident? How long does it recover after a shift? And quite frankly, how long does it take to recover after a work cycle? 12 hours is a long day, especially if you're experiencing high call volume. And so when we talk about trying to optimize which shifts law enforcement works, somebody has to work at night. So there's never going to be a time, not in the foreseeable future, where police officers just aren't working at night. So I think we have to be able to train them to how to optimize their performance when they're working at night. So how do you optimize their sleep? And again, wearing your device and training for an officer that's working midnights, it's going to give them some data and some tangible feedback where they can see, okay, my baseline is different this year than it was last year. What has changed? Oh, well, I'm working midnight shifts now. I've changed my roles in the agency. I'm in a new area. Everything that I'm doing is now new compared to where I had experience before. So there's just another plug. All right, let's wrap this up. Let's end with, if you, in a perfect world, where do you see your technology integrating? You just I think maybe you gave us a little hint, integrating with the body cameras, but if I'm a chief and I'm interested in this technology, and I shoot you an email, and we're gonna get your contact stuff, everything on here in a minute. What could I expect as a chief from a police department that wants to do some of this cutting edge training, if I call you and have you come in and work with you?
Yeah, sure. So we're currently, running our beta program where at a much reduced price, you can, depending on how many units you want and, how you want to use it. But, we have kind of two arms. We do academies. So for that, it's a little bit of a different model where you just put it on everybody in the class and you track them over time for 6 months, 3 months, however long the academy. And they essentially get the best benefit, I think, because they can see their improvement, they can modulate their training along the way and get the best benefit. And then for departments that do in-service training once a year, for 3 to 4 days or a week, we offer an in-service package as well. And there it's typically in our experience, the trainers have some guys that in mind that they want to track over time, and they kind of put it on them in those 3 to 4 days in their scenario-based training, really get that feedback out to them, give them some tools, leave them some tools that they can take with them after the training. In addition, we're now launching, it hasn't launched yet, but the real-time program where they can take the device with them in the real world. So it's outside of training. So yeah, departments can give me a call and we can discuss how many devices, how many officers they want to train, and we give them a quote, and then we have like a month free period where they can just kind of get their hands on the device. We offer train to training session, so train the trainers, they use it for a month and then they make a purchase decision or not based on that experience.
That's really cool. Well, maybe I have to go back to work. Maybe I need to do it.
I send one to you. We also have an individual program where
yeah, we'll talk.
Yeah.
We'll definitely have to talk about that offline. Obviously, there's a ton of potential for this. All right, so I think in the end, if I were to summarize this, really, in policing in particular, we have to change the way that we train the vigilance zone.
Yeah.
Because we can't change what stressors we're going to encounter. Yeah. All we can do is train our response to those stressors.
We need to learn to be comfortable in those high stress situations without pushing. So I talk about this in the Michigan talk in detail, but essentially what that switch from a normal thinking zone to a fight or flight zone does is it becomes very intolerant to ambiguity. So and escalating a situation, either using force or doing something that's disproportionate, is a way to end ambiguity. That's our response. That's how because we cannot tolerate this back and forth, this person being verbally attacking us. We just can't tolerate that. Or we're ramping up, and we come to a point where we have to end it. We feel like we have to end it, but we really need to learn how to be comfortable in that really uncomfortable zone. And our device gives you that feedback of how to get there, essentially.
Well, maybe next time we'll talk about, we could use some real world examples of, if you're wearing the device and maybe you give some sort of haptic feedback. Yeah. When the device detects that you are ramped up, you're in an elevated state of dysregulation, you get a little vibration on your arm or someplace where you're wearing that device, where it gives you feedback, something that pulls you out. That when you train yourself, when I feel that, I know I need to take a deep breath. Right. Like nice long deep breath in through the nose. but we'll save that for next time because we're coming up on our time. Anything else? Is there anything that you want to cover that I haven't talked about yet? Anything I didn't ask you that I should have? I know there's a ton more that we could talk about, but
no, I mean, I think this was fantastic. Thank you for all your great questions.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, I can't make you commit to doing another one, but I've already got a ton of questions for the next one. But until then, how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so email is best. Email me at Melis at neurosmartinc.com. That's my name, MELIS at neurosmartinc.com. You can also go to our website and send us a note there. It's neurosmartinc.com. Yeah.
Yep, neurosmartinc.com. It's neurosmartinc.com.
Yep. So,
awesome. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for spending some of your valuable time with us. This was incredibly insightful. Yeah, I might have to go back to work just so I can work with you.
Yes, please do.
All right. Okay. Well, everybody, until the next time, 1042, and we're going to throw up the video from her talk that she did with the Michigan State Police. We'll throw that in the show notes. We'll throw up those websites, and yeah, don't hesitate. Reach out now because this is the future of training.